how in the world are you supposed to chase what happened last week, guys? I'm 100% confident he will bust if there is no rushing touchdown. And unfortunately, they are the biggest underdog of the week, 8.5-point spread. Let's talk about players that could lose your matchup heading into week 2. Guys that I am potentially avoiding, they might bust. Nobody wants to make this video in the fantasy space. I don't want to make this video. I could easily look like a clown, but I got to stand up on my 2 feet and say, you know what? Say it with your chest, okay? Last week we made this video and we told you Brandon Ayuk, Rome Odunze, David Njoku, and Chase Brown had a high chance to bust in week 1. We hit on 4 out of 5 players in that video. I'd like to do the same this week. 5 players that I think are really risky to play. Number 1, and I'm not starting this guy anywhere. Like I will say I'm wrong if I am, but Calvin Ridley is not touching my lineups. I do not think you can start Calvin Ridley this week. Maybe 10% of you, he's your best option. He faces the New York Jets. The Jets defense has got to be pissed about Monday Night Football. They are ready to bounce back in a huge way. Remember, in 2023, this was by far the worst matchup for fantasy wide receivers. Last year, the Jets gave up the fewest points to fantasy wide receivers. Last year, on average, the Jets gave up only 17 PPR points per game to an entire wide receiver core. The Jets were the definition of elite in 2023. Number 1 in passing yards allowed, only 168. Number 2 in total yards allowed per game, 292. And you have to think about this. Calvin Ridley is going to be seeing on one side, Sauce Gardner. That's terrible. On the other side, DJ Reed. That's also terrible. 2 top 12 corners in the NFL as far as covering goes. We're talking about 2 guys that are top 12 in cover grades last year. Sauce Gardner himself was number 1. Here's the difference between last week when I told you to sit Ayuk versus this defense and this week when I'm now telling you to sit Calvin Ridley. Last week, we were talking about Ayuk, who was at least attached to the best offense in the NFL. I mean, last year, they were second in points per game, the 49ers were. That's not the Tennessee Titans right now. Last week, we were talking about Ayuk. Ayuk had competent quarterback play. Brock Purdy's a reliable quarterback for fantasy wide receivers. So at least if you had to start Ayuk, you were like, you know what? Purdy's decent. It's a good offense. This could work out. Meanwhile, this week for Calvin Ridley, he's got Will Levis. Guys, Will Levis last week completed 59% of his passes, 2 interceptions, had a QBR of 30. And sure, Ridley might get 7 or so targets, but what if half of those targets are even catchable? So we're talking about, at best, maybe 4 catchable targets versus a secondary that has Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed? Not for me, guys. I cannot think of a reason why you would start Calvin Ridley this week. And again, I will be happy to hold my hand up and say, hey, I clowned, I was wrong, but I just don't think it's a good idea. You cannot trust mayonnaise boys to get your wide receiver a good target. Personally, I would rather start Demarcus Robinson now that Puka Nacua is out, Xavier Worthy, George Pickens, Jamison Williams, or Amari Cooper. All right, the second name that I think could potentially bust your week 2 is Joe Burrow. Versus the Kansas City Chiefs. This hurts me because this is my starting quarterback in the Flock League. We'll talk about that in a second, but there's a couple things to consider here. T. Higgins is very unlikely to play in this game. I mean, he has not been practicing at the time of recording this, at least the entire week. The Chiefs defense also knows how to take away your best weapon. So don't get me wrong, Chase has been dominant against the Chiefs historically, but we saw this last week with Mark Andrews. The Chiefs just know how to take away your number 1. In fact, in 6 games Mark Andrews has faced the Chiefs, he has been shut down pretty much every single game. Steve Spagnuolo and this defense, they just know how to target your best weapon. And if there's no T. Higgins on the other side, what does that mean for Jamar Chase? Are they double covering him all game? Who does that leave for the Cincinnati Bengals? What weapon does that leave for Joe Burrow to work with? I mean, guys, we're talking about a Bengals offense who last week without T. Higgins was only able to put up 10 points against the Patriots. And yes, there should have been another touchdown. Their tight end fumbled it pretty much on the goal line. But there are just so many signs to me saying I don't think Joe Burrow's the best start. And, you know, there's also reports that his wrist could be hurting him at the moment. I don't know if that's real, but there's just enough risk that I personally think there are better options. I'd rather start Justin Fields. I'd rather start Matt Stafford, Dak Prescott, Brock Purdy, Glock Purdy, Jared Goff. Funnily enough, like I said in the Flock League, I'm currently debating between Joe Burrow and Baker Mayfield. And honestly, if you guys can just give me a vibe check in the comments down below, who would you start, Burrow or Baker Mayfield? I don't have the answer at the time of recording this video, but I am seriously considering it. as far as Baker goes, and we'll talk about it all the way up until kickoff in the Flock League. All right, the third player I'd like to avoid is actually an entire room. That's the Raider running backs versus the Baltimore Ravens. Zamir White was supposed to be a volume play, but in week 1, we were shown that in negative game scripts, Zamir White's going to be an absolutely terrible play with a very low ceiling. Last week, Zamir White was outsnapped 36-23. He was out-targeted 6-2, and he only had 13 total carries. And as far as Alexander Mattison goes, how in the world are you supposed to chase what happened last week, guys? 11 touches in a bad offense. It was a good play. He made a play, that receiving touchdown, but that is not something you expect a Alexander Mattison to replicate. I just don't know how in the world you chase this backfield at all. And here's what we know for sure in week 2. Zamir will bust if he doesn't score a rushing touchdown. I'm 100% confident he will bust if there is no rushing touchdown. And unfortunately, the odds are very high that the Raiders will be in a negative game script. According to sportsbooks, they are the biggest underdog of the week heading into week 2, 8.5 point spread. Maybe you can play Mattison because they're going to be down and he might be that guy. But honestly, I think there's a lot better options out there. I'd rather start Gus Edwards, Devin Singletary, Zach Moss, Najee Harris, and Jerome Ford. All right, the fourth player I'd like to avoid, and it's really more of a group rather than a player again, the Jags wide receiver room. And this hurts me as a Brian Thomas truther. This is very, very painful to say. I just really don't like this matchup, guys. Cleveland's defense gets a ton of pressure on the quarterback, and they have some incredible cornerback play. I mean, guys, just last week, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, CeeDee Lamb, was pretty much shut down, and he had 10 targets. He only caught 5 of them. He had, around 14 PPR points? That is not what you expect from CeeDee Lamb. I have a lot more confidence if you have to start one of these names in Brian Thomas Jr. because Christian Kirk is just reliant on targets. Brian Thomas Jr., one of those deep targets can end up paying off your entire week. We saw it last week with Brandon Cooks, right? Yes, he had 7 targets, but he only caught 4 of them. But he got into the end zone with that deep touchdown in the corner of the end zone. So that would be Brian Thomas, in my opinion, if it was anyone. And Kirk continues to see less snaps than Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas Jr. You can see only 38 snaps. He does not play in 2 wide receiver sets very often. There's just a lot of red flags for me, and I hate saying this as a Brian Thomas Jr. guy. I just desperately want Brian Thomas to still smash. I'm playing him in a home league. He is my best option, but I wish I had these other names to start instead, like Jamison Williams, Amari Cooper, Lad McConkey, Zay Flowers, Keenan Allen, and Michael Pittman Jr. Okay, the last group that I'm avoiding is the Cowboys running backs here in week 2. They face the New Orleans Saints. And yes, the Saints had a great matchup in week 1 versus the Carolina Panthers, but their run defense looked legit, guys. In week 1, they gave up the fewest rushing yards. They had the lowest yards per attempt allowed. They gave up the second fewest total yards to any opposing offense, and they gave up 10 points, which was second lowest in the NFL that week. Yes, again, I'm aware the Cowboys are far superior than the Panthers, but this is going to continue to be a split backfield in Dallas. You can see last week, we had Zeke Elliott with 32 snaps to Rico's 28. You can see on early downs, 25-19. You can see on short yardage, these guys are splitting work. On third downs, they're both getting in there. Really, the goal line work is the only reason why you would lean towards Zeke because he got the only goal line carry last week. But what if that changes? What if the vibes are just different and they give it to Rico this week? There's just a lot to be concerned about, in my opinion. If I had to start one of these names, it would be Zeke, but I am a little bit concerned. I would rather start names, like we said earlier, Gus Edwards, Devin Singletary, Zach Moss, Najee Harris, and Jerome Ford. So, guys, again, I don't want to make this video, but I think someone should. I really do. I think someone should be bold enough to every week come out here and tell you, I'm scared of these names. And I'm okay to be wrong, but a lot of you might have better options. So that's what I'm doing here today. I appreciate you for watching. Drop a like, subscribe if you like the content. Last thing I'll say is if you had a player in today's video, or even if you just have a question you need to ask, check out the pinned comment, start sits, trades, team reviews. Check out the pinned comment in the comment section because we can help you at any point throughout this week. I appreciate you for watching. And we'll see you soon. All love. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.